Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our annual missions conference tonight. I have the great pleasure of introducing you to Pastor Paul Smethurst of Hope Go By Church in Connectli, Wales. And he is a dear brother who has um, really served God's church in Connectli in such a great way, and it was so evident in the time that we spent there a couple of years ago, spending time with him and his family, and being able to see the impact that he's made in that community, especially with the young children there. Um, the conversations that I've had with him was always such a blessing that I wanted to share some of his wisdom with you. And so, without further ado, please do welcome Pastor Paul Smethurst. Thanks.
Kwan Yong Hamnida, Croeso Cynnes Ici Gyd I Gymru. Welcome to Wales. First of all, I want to thank you for the opportunity of being able to share with you today. But also I want to say thank you to you for the privilege that we have had in partnering with you in the gospel and receiving the generosity of you sending teams and the encouragement and the ongoing prayers of those people for us here in Llanelli and further afield in Wales. We are so grateful to you. Thank you ever so much for serving with us here in Wales. I stand here today on Llanelli Beach at the high water mark. The tide comes in and out twice every day. I also stand about 2 miles as the crow flies from Moriah Chapel in Lucca. And we are well aware of the story of the way that God has worked there in the past with the great 1904 revival, and the way that that impact, that high water mark of spirituality in the nation of Wales affected the globe. In 1907, it touched your own home nation, the nation of Korea. And then in 1908, the Azusa Street revival was birthed. And that started the global Pentecostal movement with all of its impact. And yet as we look around at the beach today, there's evidence of even higher watermarks. And in a sense, in Wales, though we celebrate 1904, many would suggest that there are higher watermarks of spirituality in Wales. In the last part of the 1700s and the early part of the 1800s, God worked in the nation in a way that was far longer lasting and in many ways far deeper rooted than 1904. The great evangelical awakening in Wales represents for many the highest watermark of spiritual blessing in the nation of Wales. But whether we stand looking at 1904 or whether we look at the great evangelical awakening and celebrate all that God has done here in the nation in Wales in the past, we recognise that whatever's gone, that today the tide is an awful long way out. In Habakkuk chapter 3 and verse 2, we read these words. The prophet says, "Lord, I have heard of your fame. I stand in awe of your deeds, O Lord. Renew them in our day. In our time, make them known. In wrath, remember mercy." Like us, Habakkuk could look back to the distant history of the people of God, to the high watermarks of their spirituality. And yet at the time of writing, he was in no doubt as to how far the tide had gone out. And as we look at the nation of Wales today, we would echo those thoughts too. In many ways, Llanelli is a miniature of what has happened throughout the nation of Wales. The town of Llanelli is but 3.7 square miles. And yet in 1904 there were over 40 churches and chapels in the town. And yet today, in 2020, there are less than 15. Many have been demolished. Others lie derelict and are empty. There are some that have grown, and the people gathering week by week are increasing. But many survive with just a handful of worshippers gathering week by week, if they gather week by week. Like the nation of Israel in Habakkuk's day, Wales is a land that has kept our buildings made for worship, and yet we have lost the presence of the God who we purport to worship. In 2001, a census was carried out in Wales, and part of it showed the religious affiliation of the people of Wales. And it told us that in 2001, 71.9% of people said that they were Christians, and only 18.5% of people said that they had no religion at all. Yet only 10 short years later, in 2011, we find that now only 57.6% of people said that they were Christians, and 32.1% of people now were saying that they had no religion at all. We wait to see what 2021 census tells us about our nation. But these statistics already show us that Wales is now the most secular of all the nations in the United Kingdom, with all the implications of that. In 2007, Tearfund did a survey of people who attended church. And when we look at the statistics from Wales, we learn this: that there are a large group of people in Wales who used to attend church. They're called de-churched. And the survey asked each of those people who used to attend church but no longer do, how many of them would be open to the possibility of going back to church sometime in the future. And the huge challenge that came to us in Wales was this: that out of those that were asked, 46% said that they would never ever consider returning to a church again. Their experience of church had been so difficult, so painful, that their choice would be never ever to go back again. The tide has gone a long way out in Wales. And as we look to our nation, we see particular areas that challenge us as God's people, particular places, particular groups of people that the challenge is greatest amongst. The first of those would be those communities in our nation that would be referred to as communities that are deprived. Very often new housing estates or post-industrial communities, where there is high unemployment, where there are multiple problems socially in those communities. And all over Wales we have communities like that, where the need is huge to hear the good news of Jesus Christ, and yet the people sharing it are few. The second area is the rural communities here in Wales. Wales is a land with huge rural areas. And in those areas there are many, many small villages and hamlets with 100, less sometimes, people living in those places, miles away from the next village. And as Christians, they challenge us. For many of those small communities have no living, viable Christian witness. Maybe not even a Christian living in those villages and hamlets. The rural communities are a great challenge to us as we look at our situation in Wales today. And finally, we see the Welsh-speaking communities up and down the nation of Wales. Over 20% of the population of Wales speak the language of Welsh, and many of those people live in the context of Welsh language communities, where that's the language that they would speak. That's the language that they use at school, at work, in their community, in the pub, in their club, in their sports club. And we see tremendous need in our Welsh language communities of people who are able to go and in the language of Welsh share the good news of Jesus Christ in a relevant and contextual way to Welsh-speaking people in the nation of Wales today. And yet, there's hope. There's hope because we come with our pleas to a God who hears. Habakkuk chapter 3 verse 1, the very verse before the one we read, says this: a prayer of Habakkuk the prophet. Habakkuk was coming, recognizing how far the tide had gone out, recognizing what God had done in the past, and he was seeking a God who still cared, who still heard, and he longed to see move amongst his people again, just as we do in our nation of Wales. In 1735 in Wales, the situation spiritually was so bad, the tide had gone so far out that the great hymnist William Williams at Pentecelyn said that God was a stranger in the land. In August of that year, Griffith Jones, a clergyman in Llanddora in Carmarthenshire, wrote to a friend, and he said, "It seems to me as if God is about to leave, to depart from the land." He went on to write these words, and I quote, he said, "It is now, if ever, that we should stir ourselves and lay hold on him, as the prophet says, and by earnest resolution, fixed thoughts and flaming affections, solicit his return and ask him to stay with us." And small though the Christian community in Wales was at the time, weak though it felt, it committed itself to pray. And rather than in resignation sit back and accept the situation, it began in humble and honest service to respond to the promptings of the Spirit of God in their hearts, to begin to do new and courageous things in the land. Somebody once said that when the tide has gone fully out, you know it's about to come back in. My mind goes to Matthew's Gospel and the end of chapter 9 and the beginning of chapter 10. We see there the story of Jesus looking at the community of which he was a part. And as he looked, it says this, that Jesus saw that they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. And as we look at the nation of Wales today, we see a similar picture. So many people harassed with difficulties and challenges that they experience day by day in their lives, not knowing where to turn for help, looking for leadership, and yet not finding leadership that has the integrity that they long for and has the purpose and direction that they know deep inside they are seeking. And yet as Jesus looked at those people harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd, he saw something else. For he said this to the disciples, looking at those people, "The harvest is plentiful." These very same people who were harassed and helpless were the harvest that Jesus knew was to be brought in. And so he looked at the 12, and recognizing that they were few in number, he said, "The workers are few. So ask the Lord of the harvest to send out workers into the harvest field." We're praying that God sends out people into the harvest field of Wales, to those places where people are harassed and helpless, to point to the one who is the good shepherd. And yet, as we do, we learn a lesson from Jesus. Because Jesus was not content to ask his disciples to pray that people would be sent. But those few who were praying, the 12, Jesus then immediately sent them out into the harvest field. In chapter 10 and verse 5, we read these words, "These 12 Jesus sent out." And we sense that in Wales, that though we feel as God's people in the land, we are few in number, at times we feel weak, we sense that God is sending us out into the harvest field. And there are different ways that we see that. The project Cynllun Derwin, or the Derwin Project, began this year. The word Derwin is the Welsh word for oak, and it's taken from the passage in Isaiah where God promises to establish oaks of righteousness. And through this programme, a group of 23 young Welsh people are being trained for pioneer leadership here in Wales. Through teaching and mentorship and practical experience, they're being equipped to lead in situations where the gospel as yet has no roots, so that they can go out and serve the Lord in that situation. Will you pray for Cynllun Derwin, the Derwin Project, and those 23 young people, that God will do something significant in each heart? The denomination that I am privileged to be part of, the Baptist Union of Wales too, are experiencing something similar of the sending of God. This year we began, in partnership with the Forge Canada, a 2-year training program called Ethos. And together we are looking at the challenges of moving from being a traditional model of church that was relevant in Christendom to become a missional church that is effective in reaching our communities in Wales now as they are, not as they were. Each 2 weeks, 70 leaders and leadership teams are gathering together to share and pray and listen. Will you pray for us as we gather that God will enable us to hear what he is saying to us, to respond in a way that is appropriate and courageous and practical? Also, I am so glad that I am part of the Hope Go By church family here in Llanelli. And we have seen God sending us out too. We have this year met in the building, well, on very few occasions. And yet this Christmas, we have seen a greater sense of reaching our community than ever before. Normally we have a candlelit carol service on Christmas Eve, and it's our biggest service of the year. This year we were not able to do that. And so God stirred us to take gifts to the people of our community. And as we knocked on doors and gave those gifts, to assure them that we were praying for them. And just to express that we were giving these gifts, representing what Jesus did on that first Christmas, giving himself to the world, freely, generously. We saw people exclaiming with surprise how we as God's people would possibly think of doing such a thing. Others wept as they received those gifts. God was at work as he sent us out, and that's the key, isn't it? The harvest is not in our churches. The harvest is outside of our churches, and God is sending us out. And how grateful we are for our partnership in Wales in every way and every part with people from the nation of Korea. We are blessed in Hope Go By because we are part of the Baptist Union of Wales sponsorship programme, whereby we have been able to receive
a family from a church in Seoul in Korea to come and serve with us full time in making Jesus known in our community here. We're so thankful too for partnership with you as you are able to come summer by summer with teams to the nation of Wales and help us through leading the summer holiday clubs so that we can share the good news with children and young people in our community and in other parts of Wales as well. I've often wondered about that partnership that we enjoy between the nation of Korea and Wales in the gospel. Certainly, a huge reason for it is the story of Robert Jermaine Thomas, but I think there's more. For the reality is that you as a nation have experienced things that make you uniquely placed to share with the experience of people in Wales. You too in your recent history have known what it is to have your language threatened, as so many people in Wales would describe they have experienced. You too know what it is to have people from a distant place and another culture with another perspective govern in your land, just as many in the nation of Wales would describe. We're so grateful that we are able to serve God in this land, shoulder to shoulder, for the gospel.
I grew up in a place on the border between Wales and England, and there was an estuary very similar to this estuary, the Lyca estuary, and the tide used to go way out into a small central channel, and a group of us used to enjoy fishing, and so we would go there fishing. And I remember we would arrive with our tackle and everything that we needed to fish and sit and wait for the tide to come in. And then one day, one of the guys said, instead of waiting till the tide comes in, why don't we walk out to meet it? And so we did. And in 1735, that's exactly what Griffith Jones decided to do.
And so Griffith Jones established a movement of circulating schools, whereby up and down the length and breadth of the nation of Wales, he taught people to read using the Bible as their textbook. And as he did, within a few short years, he met the incoming tide of the great evangelical awakening in Wales. And as the Spirit of God brought people to life in Christ, suddenly the Bible that they had become familiar with through circulating schools came to life, discipling, encouraging, nurturing them in their newfound faith. And in many ways, that's what we're seeking to do today in the nation of Wales again. Prayerfully, practically, we're walking out to meet the incoming tide. Sure, the challenges are great. Like Habakkuk, we look back and we see what has been. And we say, Lord, I have heard of your fame. I stand in awe of your deeds, O Lord. But recognizing where we are today, with Habakkuk we cry out in prayer, renew them in our day, in our time, make them known, in wrath remember mercy. But as we do, we cry out with a sense of hope, with a sense of expectation as we serve practically, as we walk out to meet the tide. For like Habakkuk, we see a great truth, a great promise. For in the midst of the pain and the heartache of the experience of Habakkuk comes a promise. A promise that God made to Habakkuk then and God makes to us now. We read these words in the middle of the book of Habakkuk in chapter 2 and verse 14. For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. The tide is coming in. We believe that as we prayerfully serve God, a day will come again for us here in Wales, and we pray for you in your context in America and in Korea, in your homeland, where again the glory of the Lord might cover our land as the waters cover the sea.